Welcome to the podcast Accessibility for All, a live recording of the presentation Professor Karen Lucas gave at the symposium Accessibility for All at the 9th of April 2025 in The Hague, an event organized by the Dutch Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management. For a live audience of mainly policymakers and researchers, she explains the techniques she developed with her team, how Chop and Chat and Slow Sue gets people to talk about their daily life experiences with transport from the places where they live to where they need to go. Important information for transport policymakers to understand, fight and prevent transport inequality.
I think to give you a bit of background context, we've been working, as Marika said, for like 20 odd years on this agenda with the social exclusion unit that was established in 2001. So it takes a while. And it's just beginning now to gain some traction in the UK. And as you've already heard also, I think the European Union is really involved in this idea around transport poverty. And one of the key pillars of that is accessibility, as Cass has just said. So I think we have to think of it as a big part of economic, social and environmental well-being. We have to really think of it in that way. It isn't just sort of about getting around. It is about making sure that we have a strong economy, making sure that we have a sustainable environment, and making sure that we have social well-being. And those are the three pillars of trying to deal with this social exclusion agenda. Because of lack of access amongst low-income populations in the UK, of which this was a large percentage of the population and still is, they were often really excluded from being able to participate in everyday activities. So there was high incidence of unemployment, poor health, bad education, also incidents of crime, people living in areas where they basically were locked in there, almost like an enclave. So they couldn't get in and no one could get in and they couldn't get out. And so what we started to talk about of this was an idea about transport-related social exclusion, that as a result of a lack of transport, whether that was private or public, then people were basically not able to participate fully in society and therefore not able to fulfill their full potential, basically. And as I've already said, this was a phenomenon that was predominantly amongst lower income populations. So whilst we also, like you, had an accessibility for all type of sort of agenda going on, we weren't really that interested in somebody who decided that they were going to go live out in the middle of nowhere and then suddenly they couldn't drive and they had 4 kids and they couldn't get them to school, because that was their problem, because that's where they decided that they were going to be. But when it was not a decision, when it was not a choice, then those were the people that we were interested in, and particularly thinking about young people, families on low income, teenagers that weren't able to participate fully in society, a lot of people with children, single parents, low income families where the children would maybe be able to get to school, but they wouldn't be able to do anything else, and that wasn't really very good for their social development. And then what we also thought, and I thought it was interesting what you said about the fact that this was an agenda that wasn't just about transport, but it was about all these other services. Transport is the one that's chasing it all, but actually, in fact, the problem is often being caused by the planning system, by the health organizational system, infrastructures and so on. So it's really good to pull those things together and think about it as a holistic thing that is not just to do with movement, but also with the location of where things are and with the proximity planning, and also with it as a social welfare agenda. So you were talking about social affairs, yeah. One of the big components of this was accessibility planning. And I was very, very lucky at the time to have this PhD student who came along from the Netherlands and who decided that he was going to become the expert in accessibility planning. And our Department for Transport had already developed this idea that it had this data set that it could use that could measure how long it took for people to get from the places where they lived in quite a small area, a neighbourhood area, we call it a lower super output area, and to be able to sort of measure how long it would take them to get to a centre of employment or to the nearest hospital or to the school or the college, whatever. And Euron came along and he said, that measurement doesn't work, it's not right, I need to come up with my own. So off he went and he mapped. And basically what we've done is, you see, this is this inaccessibility bit here. And basically what we were aiming to show was that as a result of a whole load of range of things, and the guys here said to me, you have to put this diagram up. So because it sort of shows the interaction between the social disadvantage. So you've got a whole load of people that are basically experiencing all sorts of social disadvantages, which I won't read out. And then there's transport disadvantage. And not necessarily are those two things the same thing. It's only when they get in the middle that you come up with something which I call transport poverty. And then as a result of that transport poverty, it means that you cannot access things. And then over time, and I must say, it's not just, doesn't happen from day to day. Over time, what happens is that you become socially excluded. And there are all these feedback links that go on. So as you're socially excluded, the less likely you are to have social advantages and the less likely you are to have transport advantages. And what I think is the best bit of this diagram is not all the stuff in the middle, but the bits around the outside, because very much based on what the social norms and practices in your country. So if everybody has a car, then you need a car, because the system is built for cars, right? But if everyone is cycling, like they do in the Netherlands, then suddenly the bike becomes a bit more of an attractive option. Whereas in the UK, you try to get someone on their bike and they will tell you where to go on your bike. They don't like it at all. And so all of these things to do with governance and decision making are absolutely important, because we can decide to push those agendas or not push those agendas. And I think particularly when you're thinking about the way in which we dealt with transport in the past, where what we've done is built huge roads and huge infrastructures to cater for traffic and congestion and these problems that we see as almost like outside of the person, to coming to something that is much more personally centralized, thinking about people who suffer a social disadvantage and transport disadvantage, and what happens to those people as a result of governance decision making. Are we going to include them or are we not going to include them? Manchester is in the north of England, and there is an organisation which is like a regional organisation in Manchester called Transport for the North. We have Transport for the South East, Transport for the East, Transport for the North. And they have recently picked up this idea of transport-related social exclusion again, because there's a huge amount of poverty in the north of England, and the north and the south, there's a big divide between them. And that is a very basic way of describing it, because it's much more subtle than that. It's not just the north and the south, but just take it as that for the time being. So they decided that they had these two agendas, one of which the past government, was talking about levelling up, which was about sort of trying to grow the economy of the north so that it could level up with the south. Or level across with the south. And then there was also this agenda of transport-related social exclusion. And what I would like to sort of say is that the types of solutions you come up for those two agendas are not necessarily the same. So whereas they were thinking about levelling up being about bringing infrastructure, big infrastructure projects like big train, HS2, all of these things, into the north to try and get the northern economy working, that wasn't going to guarantee that people who were transport and socially excluded, were going to use those things. In fact, on the contrary, they probably weren't, because they were sort of big things, and you had to think about, well, did they have the skills to match the jobs? Did they have were they all actually of employment age? A lot of people are older. So just by putting in big infrastructures, you had to have a different agenda to come up with social exclusion. There's lots of other things, and you had some of them on your diagram, like safety and health and climate and all of these other things. So there's loads of other things, affordability, that come into the transport social exclusion agenda that aren't about big infrastructure projects. And I think that's why public authorities and municipalities find it quite a hard agenda to deliver, because they are used to spending a lot of money on capital projects that are not connected to each other, projects that are, we'll do this big project and then this big project and then this big project, rather than thinking about, oh, there's those people there and they can't get where they need to go. What's the problem that those people have? Why can't they get? Maybe they don't need a massive great project. Maybe they just need a bike and a bike shed, or a reduced ticket, a cheap ticket, or they need a bus that will pick their kids up after school because the parents haven't got cars, and so they need some other form of transport to collect their kids safely. So it's quite a different agenda. So that Transport for the North did this great thing, and they went back to this idea of accessibility mapping, and they used the Department for Transport statistics because you'd run away with your data, and they basically came up with the idea that 3.3 million people were not able across the whole of the north of England to connect to these services. They were at high risk if they had to rely on public transport. And that prevented them from participating. So we're back to the social exclusion using agenda. So we're back to now. So history lesson over. And we've got a Labour Mayor, Andy Burnham, and he's decided to take the transport cause into his heart, and he's been pushing. But nevertheless, he's still not quite got it, because he thinks that if he takes over the governance of the bus network, which until now has been run by private companies with no public intervention within Manchester, that will sort it. And even if what they do is reroute the buses, that's not necessarily going to sort it out because of all these other problems. So what we're trying to do is come up with a methodology, and I probably have to get a blueprint for how you interact with communities. And you said something about it being person-centric. You have to go and ask people, because you don't know, especially if you work in The Hague and you've got all those wonderful transport services around you, and you've got a car for the weekend, and you've got a good straightforward job that just goes from 9 to 5, and all of those other things. You don't really understand. You don't know what it's like to have 6 screaming kids walking down the road alongside you when there isn't a footpath, right? It's just this perceptual thing that you have to be really grounded in what people are doing. So what our idea was that we would go into local communities and involve them in the decision-making process, and specifically engaging with these more marginalised communities to sort of think about new ways that we could engage with them around transport planning. And the idea was that we would build the capacity for policy into action. So at the moment, what's happening is one of the researchers that was on the front of the presentation, Joanna, she's about to be seconded within Transport for Greater Manchester to help them to embed this sort of process within their consultation and participation process on an ongoing basis, so that we could come up with an evidence base of what we needed. Quite often the data sets are not there to be able to do this type of micro-analysis. So they would come up with the evidence base that was needed, and then come up with these local, neighbourhood, community-based action agendas that would say what they wanted to have happen with the buses, the bicycles. Now, this is a bit idealistic, isn't it? You can imagine you've got all these tiny, tiny little places. They've all got their own plans, and one plan doesn't fit with the other, and whatever. So we understand that you have to have a bit of the sort of the way that you were doing it before. You have to have the mapping. You have to verify what you're doing. But we also understand that these focus groups and interviews and other ways of doing planning give us some insights as planners. It doesn't mean that we have to do it in every single area, but what we think is that we can come up with a sort of prototype of areas where it's this sort of population. It's mostly elderly residents living on the outskirts of a city with mostly reliant on buses and wanting to go to the hospital and the community centre. And they're a predominantly white population, and this is where they want to go. We could sort of come up with some sort of prototypes of what we think we should do. So this map will be familiar. I think, has everybody seen this sort of map before? I don't have to explain how it happens. So basically, what happens here is that these are very, very tiny, small census tract areas called lower super output areas. And what has happened is that we've mapped where there's high incidence of deprivation combined with high incidence of poor access by public transport to a few key destinations. Make it sound simple. It is not simple, believe you me. But once you've got the algorithms, you can do it for the whole country. And so then what you can see, and this one has been slightly adjusted because what we decided was it wasn't really very much point in showing Greater Manchester's accessibility in comparison to London's. What we were interested in is Greater Manchester thinking about its own accessibility in comparison to itself. So this is actually being adjusted so that Greater Manchester can think about its own high-risk areas, not Wigan or somewhere else, you know what I mean, not another area altogether. So basically pulling these areas out, and this is the beginning, only the beginning of where you might be able to go and start talking to people about what their transport problems are. It's like a sort of, it's not, oh, here we are, here's the end result. This is where you start the problem. Say, oh, look, this looks like a high-risk area. Let's go and talk. And you might go to that area and they say, oh, no, we don't care. That's because we can't get to employment. Well, none of us go to employment because, like I said, we're all retired. Or it could be that it isn't a high-risk area because they go somewhere else and you've mapped it to the nearest proximity, and in fact they don't need it to be proximal because they go somewhere else. But 9 times out of 10, those will be the areas where you know that you've got a problem going on. It may be that other areas are also in problem. Thinking then, finding an area and thinking then about, well, what is the population? So we're lucky at the moment, we've got the census data from 2021, so it's quite up to date. So we can do a lot of mapping about what does the population in that area look like, what are the retired population in comparison to car ownership. So we've got high levels of car ownership in low-income areas with a lot of retirees in it. Thinking about access to health services. This is just not doing accessibility mapping, but just plotting where the services are in relation to population census information. And then thinking about doing the accessibility maps. These are heat maps. How far can I get from this centroid to across the area according to different types of modes of transport? So you can actually start burrowing in, and this is all happening on the desk before you get there. And then you start to go to the area. And I think this is one of the things that's really interesting, is that, you know, even when you start walking, you physically get off your desk, civil servant, planner, engineer, and walk. And maybe get the bus or the metro, not go in the car. And you go to one of these peripheral areas and you see what they actually look like. And then you suddenly see, well, okay, what we got here? We've got a whole ton of traffic in a tiny little street with virtually no footpath. Right, with people parking up on the conditions here are not great for walking, let's say, right? Cycling, you guys are really proficient at cycling. Would you take a bicycle on that road? Well, yeah, you probably would, yeah. But what you can also see is that there's lots of, you know, there's lots of rundown areas. It's a really rundown area with lots of areas of like little cut-throughs and not much green. So even just by walking around it, you can sort of suddenly feel, yeah, this is a poor area and it has a lot of problems associated with it. But actually, in this particular instance, there were lots of amenities, lots of local amenities that people were making quite good use of, but they weren't necessarily doing that in a very safe environment, as I just said. So we did a lot of work on recruitment. We worked locally with local people to local community organizations to recruit people for these groups, these planning groups. Contacted the schools. We held the planning group, and this is quite important, within the area where people live. We didn't expect them to come to the centre of town. We went to them, and we held it in their community centre where they were used to going, and they felt comfortable in those centres. And we basically ran 3 groups, and this is not because these were the only socially excluded people, it's because they were the ones that we were sort of interested in finding some more out about this particular time with a limited budget. So we thought about parents of young children, senior citizens, and low-income workers. And although we really tried very hard to do all of those things, we found it really difficult to get people in the room to talk to us. And so later on, what we did was come up with a whole load of creative ways in which we could get them into the room, and I'll explain that to you to get people to come and join you, because nobody wants to talk to you about transport. And anybody that's ever done a consultation exercise on a design of a road project or a rail project or whatever knows that, you know, it's really hard to get people in the room. Most people, and the only people who want to talk to you are the old diehards that have really got an opinion, you know, the loud voices. But, you know, you don't get the average population talking to you about the complexities of a sort of like design of a right turn lane or whatever. So that in itself is a difficulty that has to be overcome. And then what we did, and this I think is one of the nicest things, so bear in mind, we'd already done all of that background mapping, right? We'd already done that desk-based analysis. And what we then did was get them to work in quite small groups to just draw on a local map, big map, where they lived, where they went to, and what mode they used by different colour pens. And from that, we were able to then later digitize these maps. But all the time they're drawing it, they're saying, we also asked them to highlight in red where they thought there were danger spots if they were walking or cycling. And all the time they're leaning over the map, they're talking to each other, they go, oh, no, oh, yeah, but you used to be able to get to Tesco's by there, but then that bus, and then you've got this whole range of information. That's dangerous there, isn't it? And also what happened was you found, like, say we were mapping air quality, and you'd get a whole area where it was like we'd see it was high air quality problems. Some people would say there was an air quality problem, and some people would say there wouldn't, because they were living at different ends of this area. So what you also realise is it's incredibly micro how people experience their transport. So you were able to get them to talk around their ideas, and then later on we were able to sort of digitise the map and put it over the top of all the other data sets that we had. So we got out these 4 sort of key themes that were around stuff to do with people's travel behaviours, what they did, where they did, how they did it, which you can't get out of the accessibility maps. People's ideas about bus provision and access as it stood, with a whole load of practical issues about the public transport system, which is what we were trying to do at this particular time, because we were trying to get them to comment on how the new B network that Manchester was going to start taking over needed to be run. And this is now doing its own thing now. So travel behaviours, it's actually now on a cycle where it's doing its own things, was things to do with issues around walking that I've already talked about, things to do with people needing more reliable services. I don't think anything that you wouldn't particularly know already. Stuff to do with particularly, we realised that there was no bus route to the railway station or to the GP surgery, which was next to the railway station. It's like, what? Only in the UK can this happen, because we haven't had any transport planning since 1985, okay? So you can excuse it outside of London. But basically what's happened is that bus providers have come in and registered routes as they decide they're commercially viable. And rather than actually planning a system which is socially servicing social needs, right? And I think there is this big difference between the commercial network and the social network. And we do have to think about the fact that, say you do decide that you're going to have a free public transport service, you really got to sort of think to yourself, okay, well, who's benefiting from that? Because the free public bus services may well end up being run on sort of commercial ideas, in which case they'll be running on the more frequent routes and not the peripheral ones. Issues around transport reliability. And I think what was interesting was, like, this person was saying, you know, I don't really go out, not because I can't get the bus there, but I don't know whether I'm going to be able to get back again. And I'm just going to be stuck there. And if you're old, or you've got kids, or you're a woman and it's night time, or for a whole load of other people, you know, it's basically that is going to stop, that's physically going to stop you going out. Another thing was with these asylum seekers, we have this system where you have to register every 2 weeks to be able to stay in the country. And they were having to go really, really long distances to be able to register. And this is just one example of a public service that's not joined up, right? And basically they were traveling for something like a whole day just to go and sign up, because they basically didn't want to miss the appointment, because otherwise they'd be deregistered, and they couldn't risk it. But it was taking them, and they weren't. It wasn't in the local area. So it's like all of these different things around that come up that might not necessarily be your engineering help. You know, it might not help you much if you're trying to design a system or you're a bus planner. But nevertheless, they are the reasons behind why people aren't using public transport services. These are the things that are going wrong. So I think we do have to think about how we might address them. The idea about, okay, yeah, the trains might be great, but the buses are cheaper, but then having to use the car to get to the bus. So we're still not doing integrated transport, right? And then a whole thing about these services, these twilight services, where if you miss that service, you've got a whole hour to wait until the next one, you know, in these different places. Yeah, stuff onto apps now. A lot of people don't use apps. A lot of apps are out there and they're not all usable. They're not always working. If the internet's not down, you know, you're not necessarily that you can't read it. It's just not working where you are. And not good network coverage in a lot of these places, which are also digitally excluded places as well. So, you know, we're doing this because we think this is doing a great service to the public. We're going to give them all their transport planning on an app. But in actual fact, really, a timetable at the bus stop cannot be really replaced. So basically, because we couldn't get people into the room, we had to come up with some more creative methods to do that. So we started to work with some people that were running workshops with communities that were disengaged, just to get them to talk about it. And we used some these things like chop and chat and slow so. So chop and chat's where people come in the room and make a meal together and talk while they're doing it. So somebody else would facilitate that cooking. This, like, I can see some people thinking, this is not about transport planning anymore, is it? This is really like, she's gone mad. But we get, so as opposed to having like 4 people in a room to do that mapping exercise, we now had 20 people in the room, okay? Could run the mapping exercises afterwards, or we could go and see them again. We built up a relationship with those people over a number of different visits. So we could go back to them and they go, oh, hi, how's the bus service? You know, how's it going? Is it going well? And they would then tell us, stitch and sew. This was with some Asian women who found it really, really difficult, slow sewing. They found it difficult to talk and communicate, so we got translators in there. They were very self-conscious. They didn't really do things that had any influence. They didn't think about they could have any influence on decision making because their husbands decided everything for them. And basically they really enjoyed this session, and they felt like they actually had some ownership over what was going to happen with the buses in their area. Nothing but positive things that came out on these things. So I think what we're trying to say is not that this sort of thing can replace what you do in your offices to do accessibility planning and design and bus planning and bridge building and all those other things. It's not going to take those things over. But I think there is a role for this more sort of personalized, person-centered interaction with the public, particularly in these areas of transport poverty where people are not empowered, they don't feel that their opinions matter, and they really have got no idea about how they would voice what they need. And so what you're doing is trying to work towards getting them to discuss the issues using these physical tools that will help to bring these voices out and bring their narratives out in order for you to have a feeling inside of what it really is like to be without transport in the middle of one of these areas with kids or as an old age pensioner, so that you become more empathetic as a decision maker. And it's nothing really to do with necessarily the fact that you would use these tools to design the system, but it would give you some sense of empathy within yourself to understand when you get it wrong, what it means. And that, I think, takes us to another level in what we're trying to do. So it's not just about measuring things, I think. It's also about understanding and feeling them. It's also about thinking about people's basic activity needs and capabilities. And it's also thinking about the fact that, and you said a great thing, you said, it's not just about the what we've got as the system now. It's about this sort of idea of restorative justice, that we might need to go into some of these places and put things right, and it's not necessarily innovation. It is just bringing people up to the standard that everybody else enjoys. And then obviously, if you're going to be thinking about social progress, you need to evaluate what you're doing against social progress. So it's not how many more people can get to work within 25 minutes. It's about what does that actually mean in terms of their well-being and their social status. Does it intergenerationally make a change when we do something like this?
Time for a couple of questions, if there are some questions from the room.
In our Social Welfare Act, there is a right to challenge. So people can challenge the government to say, well, that's our idea and we want you to deliver.
Oh, I wish.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, in terms of the governance that you have and the way that you've talked about that, you are miles and miles ahead, really, here, in thinking about the ways in which you're going to interact. And I think also, I don't know, I mean, it's my opinion that Dutch people are more capacitated to be able to do those things as well. I think they complain if they need to, like French people complain if they need to. Whereas I just think, I don't know what it is, but I think it's like particularly poor people in the UK have had the stuffing knocked out of them over and over again. They don't trust anyone to do anything, and they don't feel they've got a voice. So this is about giving them a voice. And sometimes what happens as a result of what we do this not just with transport, but housing and other things, is that they get up and protest. And if they do that... Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You identified many barriers to access, and I'm wondering how you collectively take all these barriers and then translate them or operationalize them into policy and planning.
Good. Okay, that's a really good question, and I didn't cover it enough, and I guess that's because partly we're at that stage. But we've done lots of research about we know what works. So once you've got this sorted, and somebody says to you, well, my problem is that I can't get to the hospital because the bus doesn't go there. You sort of would then say, well, is the bus what you really, really want to get there? I mean, you know, maybe what you want is a small community transport service that goes there. Or maybe what you want is a clinic that's nearer where you live, or a door-to-door service. So I think that's the other thing is that you plan your projects with. And that sounds like, again, really, really a big ask. But on the other hand, if you get those projects wrong, they're not delivering, right? So you may as well spend the time doing that. So recently I was working on a huge project called the Lower Thames Crossing Project. It was a road project that connects the Tilbury Docks in the south of England up to the north of England. And they were building this road right through the middle of 4 or 5 communities. How did they ever manage to get away with that design? I do not know. But basically it was because the rural area was protected, but the urban area wasn't, so straight through the middle. And basically we were then working with the community to sort of say, okay, how can we do this? How can we mitigate this? How can we do so? So you just had to quite painstakingly go through trying to mitigate what was happening. But at the end of the day, it stopped them protesting against the road being built. So, you know, multi-million project didn't go down the pan. So I think you just have to work with the communities.
Yeah, thank you for the wonderful presentation. I wonder, the group that you spoke to is pretty hard to find, also because they don't feel like they have a voice. How do you find them? How do you uncover the unknown of who these people are? And how do you know that this is in fact the hardest to find group and that there's actually not people with even more transport poverty out there?
There's always going to be someone with more transport poverty. And the biggest problem is that people who really got it are not going to be visible. They're going to be in their own homes, right? So you can't really go to the ultimate most transport poor person. But what you could do is take a whole load of people in an area who have got transport poverty and are going somewhere. So what we do is we go to the community centres where people are going to do things for their welfare. So maybe it might be a day centre for older people, or it might be a drop-in centre for women with young children, or it might be the clinic, or something like this, the GP clinic. So we go to the places where people will be going, and then we talk to them in their local area. That's the best we seem to be able to do, really. And even then, as I said to you, it's quite difficult to get people in the room to talk to you about transport. So you've got to sort of first win their trust with something like these cooking exercises, something. They like them. They enjoy these exercises. So then you say, can we come and talk to you again about, transport? Oh, yeah, I've got plenty to tell you about that. And then off you go. But you've got to be quite dexterous in the way that you get in there. So these site visits, the first thing we would do is identify all the sort of community organisations. And after a while, you build up a pack of people, you build up a ledger of places that you can go to talk to people. But yeah, it is quite difficult. You have to work with the agencies that are working with those communities.
Final question.
Thank you. Wonderful presentation. My question would be a sort of experience we had more a year ago. The PBL came with an interesting topic about problems facing people on transport in relation to services. And the same day, the KIM and the University of Groningen came to something saying, well, we talked with those people and they don't see it as a real problem. Idea of acceptance of rather bad conditions because they don't see, well, yeah, okay, well, we live with those sort of problems. Did you come across those sort of experience lots of time?
I mean, well, so one of the things I was just telling you about the mapping exercise was if somebody said, this is a problem with safety on this, that we have a problem with safety, they go, no, there's no problem with safety. One person lived down one end and the other person lived in another end. They were talking about a different road altogether, right? So I think you can't have these generalized perceptions. Everyone's perception is different, okay? But I mean, basically, if what you've done is found a whole load of people who say there's no problem, then don't work with them to sort the problem out, right? You work with the people who say, yes, they've got a problem, and you stick with those people to see whether the problem has been solved. It's no good thinking you've solved the problem and then asking the people who didn't have a problem in the first place. So you've got to build up this relationship with people so that when they've got a problem, you just co-design the solution, hopefully together come up with a solution, and then ask those same people whether it's made things better. Because every piece of research is a sample, right? You're always taking a sample. You're not taking the whole population. So there's going to be differences of opinion.
Thank you very much.